What did the ad say?
Astronaut wanted no experience necessary. They weren't going to choose somebody like me, right? They were bound to choose a military person, a pilot. You realise how we can adapt to so many different circumstances. I mean, potentially nobody could come back to Earth alive.
Welcome to The Art of Adventure, a podcast brought to you by Arthur Beale, outfitters to explorers and adventurers for over 500 years. I'm delighted today to be joined by Helen Sharman, who is the first British person ever to go into space. Helen spent 6 days on the Mir space station in the summer of 1991, just 6 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall. How did she get on that adventure? We're looking forward to finding out. What I find particularly fascinating with your story is most of the people we have on here were, they started sailing almost from their cots. They started going up mountains when they were very young. You sort of, space was, or even adventure was not on your radar as a child. Perhaps tell us the journey about how you went from Sheffield or north of Sheffield to actually being selected for this incredible adventure.
Well, thank you for having me, because you're absolutely right. I would never have imagined as a child that I would be coming on some sort of podcast talking about adventure, right? I was brought up really to be, to do everything safe, to be as normal as absolutely possible. And going into space, of course, just wasn't possible in the UK. Nobody was going into space. We didn't have a space programme. In fact, for a lot of the time when I was growing up, Britain actually actively had a policy of not funding human spaceflight. So there was no possibility if you wanted to be an astronaut and you were British, right? It
was very much Russia, and it was almost part of the Cold War, wasn't it? It's USA versus Russia. No one else was involved, and no one else was allowed to participate.
Yeah, there's the Soviet Union, and they invited some other countries, in terms of astronautics at least, other countries to, as part of their Intercosmos programme, to come on board, let's say. So the communist-friendly countries, so there was a Polish astronaut, a Bulgarian astronaut, a Cuban astronaut, and they all flew with the Soviet Union. Then, yes, there was there was NASA and what America was doing. And again, perhaps, later on, one or two other countries that came on board with them. But, this just wasn't part of my understanding then either. Growing up, it was, we did projects on the Apollo missions because that was all the hype, right? But we didn't hear much about what was going on in the Soviet Union. And it was just, it was just not going to be part of my life. So science was my thing. Loved it, went to university, studied chemistry. Got jobs in British industry. So I was in the electronics industry, then I worked in confectionery. Just loved it. I loved applying my science, thinking about new ways to do different things, and was working in teams of people, not thinking about space still, because as far as I was concerned, space was still for other countries, other people who were the big macho kind of American fighter pilots and military people, not people like me, right? And then all of a sudden, things change, right? And there became an opportunity. So I heard actually on my car radio as I was doing my commute on my way home, but there was an announcement that a new mission had been created. The Soviet Union, still then it was 1989 and towards the end of the Cold War, but the Soviet Union was starting to open up to Western nations. Margaret Thatcher, then our Prime Minister, had a really close friendship, as we were often told, with President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. So Britain was one of the countries that the Soviet Union wanted to open to. But the Soviet Space Agency was approaching a number of Western countries, offering them a flight for one of their people on their space program. So very much similar to the old Intercosmos days when communist-friendly countries had gone into space. It's a way of sort of soft diplomacy, really. Then suddenly this UK mission came about.
And you heard about it on a radio ad. I mean, what did the ad say?
Astronaut wanted no experience necessary.
I mean, we're roughly from the same decade. If I'd heard that, I would have thought, well, even though they want no experience, I'm not super fit. I'm not an airline, a fighter pilot. I'm not a astroscientist. I wouldn't have contemplated picking up the phone. What even makes you think that actually I could do this?
Yes, bit of a jump. I suppose part of what made it easier was that I really thought I had no chance.
Right.
So Right, that's I think quite important, really. And there was a basic criteria, so you had to be the right age range, which I was. They wanted a science or engineering type of background, and medicine possibly, but sort of some sort of what we call now a STEM career,
Right, yeah.
some experience after university, some manual dexterity. So I flew in 1991. So back then, spacecraft were quite basic. They weren't autonomous like they are now so much, and so you did really have to fix stuff and operate them much more. So all of these were basic criteria, and I knew I could satisfy those. And this announcement detailed those a bit. Oh, yeah, I could do that. It'd be fantastic, amazing opportunity. Not so much to go into space, actually, but I was thinking about that chance to go and train with cosmonauts, to become fluent in the Russian language, because Russian was necessary to speak and to understand as part of the training. All the training was done in the Russian language. But that idea of being in the Soviet Union at a time when the Cold War was sort of starting to come to an end, but a very exciting time. It was still very otherworldly. It was very exotic, right? Very different to anything I'd known. And we didn't know much, if we're honest, about the detail of living on the ground in the Soviet Union. And all that was it was just fascinating.
Was it 13,000 people applied?
13,000 applied for it. Had I known that, I might not have done so, right? But what really put me off having a go, even though I was really attracted to it, and I knew I had those basic, I had that basic criteria, so I could do it, but the idea that they weren't going to choose somebody like me, right? They were bound to choose a military person, a pilot, somebody who had these more, let's say, macho type of credentials.
Which is what I would have assumed as well, actually.
Especially the first British astronaut. And even now, I think we're in a different place socially in terms of that gender expectation. But many countries still send their first astronaut, and first few astronauts are often men rather than women. So I think there's still a society's expectation that first one will not be a woman and will be a military pilot, right? So all of those things. So that expectation made me think, I'm not going to get it. But also the idea that my colleagues would probably laugh at me for having the audacity to even consider it for myself. Once I had decided that actually it was worth a go, I could cope with somebody laughing at me. And if I didn't have a go, then there was zero chance. And I knew I could do it, and I really wanted to do it. And the more I thought about it, the more I wanted it. So I decided it was worth a possible waste of time. But actually, the more I thought about it, the more I realised just filling in the application, I was going to gain something, because I was going to be thinking about how would I operate in that situation? What would I think? Was I right for that kind of environment? So I knew I was going to learn about myself. Right. So actually, even just trying was not a waste of time. That pushed me to having a go.
Yeah, you obviously got whittled down, and it sort of was almost like a game show format, wasn't it?
There were 4 of us left in the final selection out of the 13,000 that originally applied. So after medical, psychological tests, and so on, and yes, then I think it was partly because the way it was all run was on a very much of a commercial basis. So a company had been set up because the UK government still had a policy of not funding human spaceflight. So a company was set up to manage the whole mission, and the idea was that it would gain funds in a variety of different ways. And I think this TV program, this show as it was really part of the advertising of the whole project, and to try and get other companies excited enough to come on board and help to fund the mission. So so it was one of those sort of the first time I'd really been thrust into the spotlight in quite such a big way. A very uncomfortable feeling, if I'm quite honest.
But I mean, a lot of people watched it. Yeah,
I guess. I mean, it was, for me, it was very much, all the 4 of us. We'd just spent 2 weeks in Moscow, in a hospital in Moscow, going through final physicals, medicals, and other parts of the selection. So we were brought back to the UK. We were rather sleep deprived, and the very next day we were going to be doing this TV show, and we'd never been on live TV before, right? So it was all a bit daunting. And what do I do? Do I sit here? When do I have to go and shake somebody's hand? What do I do? Do I look in the camera? All of that stuff that is trivial, but actually for us it was quite a big deal at the time. And we were still we didn't know which one of us was going to be selected. We really didn't.
And was it very competitive between the 4 of you?
Well, obviously, we knew that 2 of us were going to be selected for the training,
Yeah.
2 wouldn't.
Yeah.
And those 2 that would not were going to spend at least a few months, probably a year, actually in the UK supporting the mission. So they had a role.
Right, okay, they
but-
weren't being discarded.
No, but nonetheless, that role was unlikely to actually get them
Yeah.
into space. The idea was that actually in the first few months, as long as they were picking up Russian and other things, they were familiar obviously with the mission as well, that they could have slotted into the training program later if necessary, but not for very long because the training program was quite intense. So there was an element of competition, but actually mostly by then we'd become fairly close. And so there was actually, I would say, much more support amongst the 4 of us than there was competition. But also, of course, we were all hoping that, I wanted to go and do the training.
Yes.
I didn't really want to be one of the backups.
And the other British person selected was Major
Mace,
Mace. Yes,
yeah.
and obviously he's probably more what one would have expected, the archetypal, astronaut to have been.
So he was, flew helicopters for the army, for the UK Army, blonde hair, blue eyes. I was sure he was going to be the one that went into space. I would end up being his backup. We both had to do all of the training. We knew that. If one of us got sick, even shortly before the launch, then the other one would fly instead. And it continued really throughout the whole time that level of sort of support, because we were in this thing together and we were different people in some respects. He came from a military background, and so he was familiar with the fact that we were living on this military base. I came from a science background, so I was familiar with the science experiments. So we were able to sort of to give each other a bit of knowledge support, if you see what I mean. But it was as much at the beginning. It's that that idea that you understand the culture that you come from, you understand how each other is perceiving the world around you, which is totally different from anything else that we'd experienced. And he'd not lived in the Soviet Union before, so in many respects we were living it anew.
I went to East Berlin quite a few times before the wall came down, and the stark contrast to the west of the sort of the Soviet Union. I mean, that must have been like you're already in a different world.
Yeah. Everything, and in a way quite overwhelming, because every little detail, how you do your shopping, right, how the shops work, that you don't go to a supermarket, pick up your stuff, and then go to a till and pay, right? So everything, absolutely everything was different.
How were you treated on the base? I mean, were you treated slightly differently to the Russians? Because, historically, the sort of Soviets had quite a sort of distrust of people outside the Soviet Union.
Ironically, it was almost the opposite, that they were really keen to find out about our lives and about us as individuals, and they were keen to share their lives too. I think Star City had long been, because of it's the Intercosmos program where they'd had different astronauts from different countries coming, albeit communist-friendly countries, but they'd also actually, in the 1970s, there'd been this Apollo-Soyuz, or the Soyuz-Apollo, as the Russians would say, project. So there'd been Americans also living in Star City, training in Star City, and they knew that part of their raison d'etre, actually, for some of them at least, those that had been astronauts, so I'm thinking of Alexei Leonov, Valentina Tereshkova, they continued to do this international sort of publicity, if you see what I mean. And so they were very keen that we would be part of that. There was an anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight every year, the 12th of April, and the whole of the cosmonaut corps would go out to Yuri Gagarin's birth town, and there would be a community centre, and we would give speeches. And even the first year, so I'd only been learning Russian for a few months, but I was expected to stand up on that stage and really, Helen, would you just say a few words? After that, I was always prepared with something to say, because I knew that we would always be required to stand up and talk in public like that. But I was very happy, actually, to be part of that community. And of course, the more I found out about it, the more relaxed I became in it.
And how long was the train from when you arrived to when actually the mission, took off? Yeah. What was the time frame for that?
18 months altogether.
18 months. When was that moment that you thought, actually, I can do this, I can be the first Brit in space?
I think right at the beginning, I knew that I was capable of doing it. I never really doubted that I could do it. It was more whether or not I would be selected. I just assumed that somebody like me would not be selected. It's really now looking back that I realised perhaps much more about the bigger picture that they were looking for. So it wasn't just doing experiments in a space station and learning to speak Russian and getting on with the cosmonauts. It was that whole idea of team working. So although I was selected to be part of the training, I always assumed that I would end up being the backup and Tim Mace would fly into space instead of me. But that whole way that I think that I worked with other people, and I'd picked that up off actually by working in industry with teams of often quite different people working together, solving problems, getting on with each other, sometimes rubbing up the wrong way, but learning how to get on, even if you might not particularly like that person. You can still work together well, communicate well, and achieve what you need to do together. And actually looking back, I think there was a lot of that teamwork, that idea of give and take. Sometimes take the lead where necessary, but be prepared to step back and let somebody else take the lead where they need to as well. So it's that tolerance, the flexibility, the give and take, that actually is really important when you are an astronaut, especially in a cramped spacecraft with just a few other people. You need all of those things. You need that openness. You need. I mean, no space for egos. Absolutely none. But I think I still couldn't really believe it until the day I was suiting up, and actually sitting on top of that rocket waiting for the launch.
I can imagine. And when let's talk about the launch and everything. I mean, a few years before we'd had the unfortunate Challenger disaster. So it was quite, going into space was not without risk. Did you think, what am I doing here? This is, how did I get there? And, is it all going to be okay? Or
So this is why training is so good, of course. So in the training, not only are you understanding what is going to happen and what you need to do, but also you're working through with all of the other teams, the teams of teams, right? So it's huge numbers of people involved, but you're working through all of these contingency situations. So I knew if we ended up in the sea rather than on dry land, how we would be rescued, how the teams would be operating, what they would be doing as well. If it often just became, well, this is plan A, and if this doesn't work, then it's plan B. So I can't remember which one of us, but it was one of our spacesuits once, you check your suits. And then once you actually sit on top of the rocket, you then close the helmet and you pressure check them again, because there could have been some like a hair drop between the seal of your helmet, for instance, and that might let out a bit of oxygen. So you check your pressure, and one of us didn't have the right pressure. So we had to wipe everything and check and do again. So again, it's just plan B. It's not, oh my God, there's something going wrong. It's just a question of going through what you've been trained to do, what you've rehearsed. The training is good because it gives you background knowledge. So I think there's two things. There's the general understanding of not just the science experiments, but much more about the electronics, the life support system. So you understand how they're operating. When you turn a ball valve, in some sort of system, you feel it clunk in. You understand what that is doing. It's not just a question of push that button because we're telling you to at this particular time. So you understanding that process. So there's no unknown to be scared of.
Yeah.
The contingency and the is all part of that planning and the training that not just we as astronauts go through, but all the rescue teams, the doctors, the people in mission control. So we're all doing this together. So yes, it's completely different. I think for people looking on from the outside, we see the astronauts coming out and going up into the rocket, and then off they go. And we wonder how we would be in that situation, but we are not yet trained.
Yeah.
Once you've been through that preparation, that's what makes it firstly safe, but also doable. The risks, I mean, the hazards are always going to be there, but you reduce the risk. And you reduce the risk by thinking it through. First of all, you can rehearse something, but there are many things that you can't know every single thing that's going to happen, especially when spacecraft are not so reliable. So then because you understand the electronics behind the scenes, if you need to fix something, you can, right? So there's that whole element of understanding on the big scale, understanding specifically what you've got to do, and the rehearsing and the contingency. So it reduces the risk to something that's acceptable, minimises it in many situations.
Okay, I think it's still pretty daunting, but so your mission was obviously to take off to dock with the Russian space station or the Soviet space station Mir, spend 6 days there, do some experiments, and come back. So how long does it actually take from launch to get to the state or to do the docking?
Oh, for us, it took 2 days.
Right.
Nowadays, you can get from launch to space station in a few hours, but then we needed to take 2 days to gradually adjust our orbit and make sure we were in just the right place to get that docking going.
So the first bit's obviously very quick, isn't it? When you're launched into space, and then presumably the slow bit
less
is
than 9 minutes to actually
right.
do the launch.
Right, and that gets you what, 250 kilometres?
Actually, that gets you just over a couple of 100 kilometres high. You still need to get much higher. So the space station is typically about 400 kilometres.
Right.
So you still need to boost in your orbit after that. But the rocket gets you let's say, does most of the heavy lifting, as you'd say.
Yeah, right. And obviously you get to the docking, but which didn't exactly go according to plan, did it?
Yeah, a few I don't know how far it was, probably a couple of 100 kilometres away from the space station. And we realised that something wasn't quite right. Now, we didn't know at the time what it was, but all we knew is that we were getting some odd information. So some of the information from the computers, which of course were very basic in those days, but some information seemed, that seems about right, what we'd expect, and others was not quite right. We were also at the wrong angle to the Earth, so there was something going wrong with the navigation systems. Then we were only in contact with mission control when we were over the Soviet Union, over sort of stations that could relay our connection to mission control. Nowadays, of course, satellites give you pretty much constant communication, but then that was not the case. We were around the backside of the Earth when we to mission control when we realised this. So we had to make a decision on our own. Now we had, I suppose, there are three choices really. You can sort of think, oh well, we'll let it carry on, and automatically we'll take our chance. Bit of a dumb situation when you know that automatically things don't seem to be going very well. You can take over manual control and manually dock onto the space station. Now, there are risks involved in that, of course. Now, that was something that we had trained in, one of many scenarios that we'd trained for, most of which we didn't need to use, but this was one that we did need to use. We knew that if we got it completely wrong, missed the space station by a mile, actually that's fine because you're still safe, you're still in orbit. We had enough fuel to go all the way around the world again and have a second attempt at this docking. But if you miss your docking port by just a few centimetres, then you risk damaging the space station and your spacecraft. The two cosmonauts on board the space station, they're not very happy about it. For us three getting to the space station, we're not very happy about it either. I mean, potentially nobody could come back to Earth alive, right? So that's the situation. So we had to make sure that we were each in not just a physical position, but a mental position and prepared to go through with what we needed to do. Again, nowadays, manual docking would be done just by the commander, but then each one of us had to actively participate in that. So I had operations of the outside, like a periscopic camera, so that the commander could actually see where he was going.
Right.
The flight engineer was working out what information he thought was reliable and verbally giving the commander some of the information and sort of velocity, distance, that kind of thing. And then the commander had his joystick controls. Yeah. So that's how we got to the space station.
And presumably, I think you have 2 attempts, don't you? And if you can't do it in 2 attempts, you've just got to go home.
Well, there's enough fuel to have... I suppose there's enough fuel technically to have a third attempt, but then you've got no way to get home. Yeah. So you have a second attempt at the docking. If then you didn't make it, you would just have to abort the mission and come back. And that was, I suppose, our third alternative was instead of going for the manual docking, we could just go for an abort straight up.
Yeah.
But no, we realised that communicating and so on, and we realised that yes, that was absolutely fine. We could go ahead with that, and we were each and trusting, of course, of each other. So you trust each other totally. Right, it's your life. It's their lives as well, which didn't feel difficult to do because we'd worked together. We knew what each other would have felt in various situations. So we knew each other quite well by then. We knew that we'd rehearsed this particular situation together, and we could trust each other to get on and do it. So we did make contact the first time, fortunately, which is all very nice. But then there's an agonising hour and a half where you're checking the seals, making sure that you're not leaking air between your spacecraft and the space station before you can open your hatch.
And the space station had, there were 2 Russian cosmonauts, and they'd been there for how long?
They'd been there for 6 months.
Right.
So imagine actually, 6 months, just 2 of you on board a space station where there is no satellite communication. The only way you're communicating with the Earth is by your radio. So you communicate with mission control. Mission control can also relay that sometimes they will make a special effort and they'll allow families to come into mission control and they can talk with their families. Sometimes they could send a special station receiver to the families' homes. But that was not normal. It was really just the 2 of them. They also had an amateur radio station by the time I got there. And what they really loved was to be able to make friends in various parts of the Earth, right? Just using this amateur radio station. So, but yeah, that's how out of contact they really were, how isolated they had been. So you can imagine they were really looking forward to having the three of us arriving, a bit of extra company, somebody else to talk with, and physically, the bear hugs, right? That touching somebody else. You might think, that's the last thing you want in a cramped spacecraft, but no, they really wanted to have that human
Physical
experience.
And presumably you brought supplies as well.
We had not much, because of course most of our cargo was us and our experiments. They have cargo ships that arrive every couple of months as well. But yes, we brought some treats, let's say, so things that they wouldn't normally have. We managed to find some fresh oranges, which was quite a rarity actually in the Soviet Union then. And we'd packed some fresh oranges, which of course, compared to space food, something fresh that smells so delightful.
Is it easy to eat an orange in space?
When it sprinks, of course, the
juice goes
the bit of juice carries on going. And so you get a bit sticky. But that smell was so nice, because you don't get the fresh smells so much. It was an orange with pips in it. And I brought my flight suit back with me when I returned to Earth. And when I unpacked it, I found some pips in one of the pockets.
Excellent. So you were in space for 6 days, and obviously at the time the sort of almost the instigator of the whole Soviet space program and the reaching out to outside of the sort of the Iron Curtain was Gorbachev. And did he ever contact the space station or talk to you or anything like that?
On the first night, just after we'd docked, so after we'd had this rather sort of anxious, let's say, manual docking, yes, I had no idea he was going to do this, but Mission Control, they radioed up, and one of the first things they said, great, we got there finally, but there's somebody very special who'd like to talk with you from the Kremlin. Helen, over to you. My goodness, if I'd known, right, I would have thought of something very clever to say to him, I'm sure, but I, it was honestly, it was just a chat, and it was Gorbachev just basically making a mark and saying, this mission is important. Of course, it wasn't me personally, but it was this British mission. It was part of this opening up of the Soviet Union. And it was a chat, right? So it was very jovial. He was cracking jokes about his food that dinner that night in the Kremlin compared to our space food. And he was sure he was going to enjoy his more than we were going to enjoy ours. It was so lovely. What a privilege. To be with such a person who was at that point still steering the Soviet Union through this transition into becoming so much more of an open country to the rest of the world.
You've mentioned several times you were incredibly well drilled and trained, and any sort of anxiety and sort of worry about the mission was almost overcome by this excellent training. But there must have been times when perhaps you had a bit of downtime, or before you went to bed, or when you were looking, or when I say to bed, to your hammock, but or when you're looking out the window, where you sort of almost had to pinch yourself and sort of say, what is going on here? This is just incredible, and almost forget the training and just marvel and enjoy that moment.
Yes, I'm saying you've had to forget hammocks. Right.
Yeah. Sorry, it's not a hammock, is it?
Because that relies on gravity. It's so funny, isn't it? How we naturally, you have to. But when you are in space, you take yourself out of this feeling that everything, that it's natural. You put something down. You don't need to think about it. Yeah. But once you are there, you adapt so quickly. And so yes, it's a sleeping bag that you tie to the wall and you just snuggle into your sleeping bag. There we go.
That's a great, good correction.
But the downtime, life is scheduled, and by nature it needs to be. And Mission Control actually probably does a very good job of making sure that we use our time most efficiently. But certainly in the evenings, we had downtime where we were scheduled to be together, where we would eat dinner together, enjoy feeling weightless still and exploring our environment. And often, once we'd done what we needed to do, food cleared away, anything else that was preparing for the next day, there would often be a good half hour where we could do what we wanted. And every night we gathered around the biggest hatch we could find and just looked out, just together. These 5 little heads around a sort of circular window, and just looking out at the earth below us. If the station happened to have reoriented, then we'd see the stars. But we would just gaze. Sometimes we'd talk about what we could see, families and friends that we'd left behind there. Sometimes we would just gaze and just be. That moment of wonder we might call it some sort of meditative kind of thing now, but or even mindfulness. But then it was just our time, just to be in our own brain, with each other, in that environment.
Fantastic. So you did your 6 days at the space station, and it was time to leave. So how many of you then left?
3 of us left. I left with the old crew, so with
Right.
the people who'd been there already for 6 months.
So there was just going to be 2 left on board. Yeah. Would you like to have stayed longer?
I'd have loved to have stayed longer. Yeah, I did actually ask, but there's no go. Yeah, it would have been great.
And obviously you were travelling back with the 2 astronauts who were obviously previously there, leaving the 2 who you'd spent 18 months training with. Was that tough?
Oh, it was awful. I knew I had to come back. I knew the time was there, and I'd had a great time in space. And it was just part of what you need to do. I was coming back with 2 people who'd been there for 6 months. They were looking forward, obviously, to coming back home. I was not, because I hadn't had enough time in space. I wanted to be there for longer. But yes, I had to say goodbye to Tolya and Sergei, my commander, flight engineer, 2 of the best friends I'd ever had, the 2 people with whom I had trusted my life. 2 people who I'd become so close to, it was just tears all round. Really, we knew what we were going through. We knew how we were all feeling. So words were just completely insufficient. It was just hugs and tears.
And did you, on the sort of return journey, were you just feeling a bit down because you'd left your colleagues, you'd quite like to have been there, or mixed emotions?
No, you're always on to the next thing, sadly. So you, even though it's much more of a sort of, I suppose, a ride on the way back, there's not so much to do. There's a little bit of mental calculation, and I actually had a pencil. I had to sort of scribble some mental calculations down on part of the spacecraft. That's how basic we were in those days. So it wasn't completely sort of relax and just enjoy the ride, but there was a lot of that. But we had our radio still, right? So we could still talk with the people on the space station even after we'd left it.
Right.
And we did chat. And Tolya could say, I can see you going further and further away. And then there was a time when we were so far away that the radio was just breaking up, really, and it was difficult to make out what we were saying. And Tolya said, I'm just going to play you some music to say goodbye. So, yeah, it was just a beautiful way to leave the space station behind.
Must have been very emotional. And what is the journey back like? Is it like the splashing into sea that we see on the movies, or how exactly does it go from exiting the spacecraft to getting back onto land?
Well, it's hours from exiting the spacecraft. So you get into your own Soyuz return vehicle, close the hatch on the space station, and then literally springs are really just sort of pushing us away from the space station. When we're a safe distance, we can fire our retro rockets. That then slows us enough to come back through the atmosphere. But from firing those retro rockets, there's only about 20 minutes or so. So we fire those over the South Atlantic, sort of actually over South America, really, sort of the eastern part of South America. And then our trajectory takes us over the Atlantic, and we're aiming to land in Kazakhstan on a nice sort of flat, dry part of the world. So yes, so
actually on land as opposed to sea.
Absolutely, it's dry land. So we have dry land or water. It very much depends on your geography. Right. So the Soviet Union didn't really have a lot of easily accessible water from where they were, but a lot of flat, dry land. And actually, if you're going to be diving into the water and then your buoyancy brings you up, that's relatively easy. But if you just want to land on the surface of water, water doesn't really absorb much of the energy of your impact. Right. So although it doesn't seem intuitive, actually, you can imagine a nice ploughed field. You can imagine how that would absorb much more of the energy of the impact. So it's not so bad, actually, landing on dry land. Right. And then about a metre above the ground, retro rockets fire. So we have a few what they call soft landing rockets, but it's not a soft landing. It's been described as a car crash, to be quite honest.
Oh, really?
But you do bump quite heavily. You have a sort
you
of a shock.
Brace yourself for
you
it.
do, and so the control panel tells you when you're sort of imminently about to hit the ground. Your seat has already risen up, so there's like a shock absorber, sort of with gas. So you've got a little bit of a cushioning effect, and also the seat is moulded to fit our backs, so we're in overall contact. So that also helps to spread the load a little bit.
Back to Earth, literally with a bump.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite strange to suddenly think, almost 2 totally different worlds in the space of a day.
I guess, but it was, I suppose you're just always getting on with the next part of what you need to do. again, I think it's when we look at this from afar, we see the astronauts being sort of dragged out of the spacecraft. Possibly, we see them sort of sitting almost prone or in their seats because, of course, you're feeling gravity again, and you don't really want blood to be pulled away from your head if you could help it. So to stop them fainting. So yes, we see that, and then we see them getting taken off, maybe a wave if we're lucky, and we don't see them again. And we imagine that's it. But of course, you're beginning the medical debriefing, and the technical debriefing happens very, very quickly. Sometimes immediately, some of it, but it's also getting used to physically feeling gravity again. Seeing all these people, and there are basic needs, right? I've been in my spacesuit for 6 hours or something. There is an emergency toilet on Soyuz if I really needed to, but you don't want to be undoing my spacesuit. So I needed to pee, right?
Yeah.
So there's some really basic stuff, and you're in the middle of the Kazakh desert, and there's a great big tent set up, and so the toilet was a bucket. And so you don't suddenly sort of come back to, let's say, to normal life. There is a transition in every sense of the word, but humans are so adaptable. Yeah, and that's the joy actually of feeling weightless, feeling heavy again, that you realise how we can adapt to so many different circumstances.
And what was your abiding memory of your time on the space station?
Oh, I mean, there's so many, I suppose, fragments. I think there are three big parts of it. Feeling weightless, that camaraderie with the crew, something that will stay with me forever. They're best friends.
So they're still best friends?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you can't forget that. And the trust that you need to put in those people, the trust that they put in you, that the openness, the honesty, how we communicated, not just with each other, but also, of course, with all the rest of the teams in mission control and elsewhere in the mission. But all of that just binds you very, very strongly. Not many people on Earth have experienced that. So we have that to share still. So I suppose that's also what tends to bind you onwards. You've got that experience that you can't totally explain to other people who haven't also experienced that. But of course, the other amazing thing are those views and just looking out of the window. So yeah, those three things combined, I suppose, are the biggies. But it's made up of so many little moments. And I hope it's those little moments I won't forget as well.
Yeah, I mean, those views, I mean, which obviously lots of astronauts reference, I mean, that must just be incredible.
It's almost entrancing. And I think, I mean, the stars are one thing. And wow, just, the more you look, the more you can see because your eyes then become accustomed to the darkness. But looking back at the Earth, so beautiful. And I think it's partly because it's constantly moving because, of course, the Earth is spinning. As the Earth is spinning, we are orbiting the Earth. So we're going northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. So, you get all the seasons in one orbit. In 92 minutes, you've done all the seasons on Earth. You've gone north, south. And then when you've come back to where you are, so after 92 minutes, if like in space, you're kind of back there again. But the Earth has moved around by about 13 degrees. So you're not back over the Earth exactly where you were before. So you get this constantly changing view. We'd talk about our families, our friends that we'd left behind, that were in those parts of the world where we were flying over. So you have that emotional connection always as well. And of course, then the colours, we talk about the blue planet, the pale blue dot, but it really is this gorgeous blue, and not a dark blue, but somehow a deep blue. And I guess it's perhaps the scientist in me would like to think about the water molecules and absorbing the various frequencies of the wavelengths of light coming out of the sun, but yeah, it's still, however much you understand, you can never really completely understand it. There's always this element of mystery and wanting to find out a little bit more, and the fact that combines with the beauty of it is just so entrancing.
Helen, I mean, what you've done is just incredible and amazing, and it's quite hard for most of us to get our head around it. And you're back on Earth. How can you? I suppose. How can you get the same intense excitement, satisfaction, joy from normal life having done that? Did you discover other adventures, or how did you sort of satiate that need?
So I suppose I still would like to go back into space, but assuming I don't get that opportunity, but even not, I still want to discover the world, right? I've always loved mountains, and I've discovered that since my spaceflight, looking down on Earth, the Himalayas, I mean, just spectacular. I did go to the Himalayas not long after my space mission. I just really wanted to feel how they would be within the mountains rather than just looking down on them from above, and just to explore the world, find out about different cultures, which of course I learnt about when I started my training. And I think that's for me is also the value of exploration. It's not just the physical world; it's the human aspect of the world as well, and how we integrate our lives with it and with each other. And any opportunity to go somewhere that's a bit different, a bit out of the ordinary. But if it's up high, it's got a bit of a special nature for
I
me.
can imagine. And when you're on the Himalayas, do you sort of look up into space and sort of? I mean, can you comprehend that you were there?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of my life. I suppose partly because I'm not the only person in the world who has done that. So I do have people who I can talk with. Every year there's an astronaut congress. I go to it quite often. We have a European astronaut reunion most years as well that I go to. So yeah, there are people who've also navigated their way, not just in space, but actually then through their lives afterwards. So I can pick up hints and tips from them. It's not so much about the mental crash, the downside. Oh, I'm not living that excitement anymore. It's just always about wanting to move forward in life with a challenge, whatever that challenge is. And yes, it's nice to have a challenge sometimes of going out with your paper map and and just being on your own in the hills. That sometimes is just amazing. But equally to share that with other people as well also. So yeah, so it's that combination, the richness of life. And often these opportunities in life are quite transient. Right. So the idea that we can sometimes, you meet somebody who that might be the person who not just gives you the idea, but perhaps then with them, you're able to strike up a relationship that can help you to push forward a project that you might not have done before. Whether that is an exploration project or you're exploring in your mind or exploring some sort of other discovery, I think it's for me that they're all completely interlinked. Adventure is one thing in terms of physically going out into the world, but it's also an adventure in our own brains, and it's that a desire to keep challenging ourselves, and to realise that we're capable of so much more than we know. When you do give yourself that chance to go and do something a bit different, it gives you the confidence to do something else. And I think that's possibly also why people do continue to do more and more, because they realise they can. Yeah. So start small, and you can take your life off in all sorts of directions.
Yeah, an excellent philosophy. As I said at the beginning, I mean, your story is amazing in so many levels, but the fact that you weren't destined to be an adventurer at all and turned into one of our great adventurers is just an incredible story. So thank you very much for your time and for sharing your stories with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a delight to talk with you.
Brilliant. Thank you.